The audacity of a powerful story is that it sees you today, not for these circumstances around you, but for actually who you are becoming, right? And this is a podcast that is for people who are becoming thought leaders. They're not yet published in the New York Times, they're not yet standing on TED stage. But today, you need to understand, you need to have that level of belief that, yes, I am. Full stop.
And I think to be audacious in the face of so much structural violence and power exerting itself upon you it's almost a miracle, right? It's a profound thing. And so to meet your circumstances with audacity,
Yes.
to refuse to do the opposite, which is to meet your circumstances with fear, with anxiety, with apology. Wish I could say that I am the one who decided to meet my circumstances with audacity, but that was an inheritance. That was a gift. Say, I will not just read, but I will write some of the most incredible prose this world has ever seen.
Ever in the English language.
So that's that kind of audacity.
You're listening to Madam Speaker Says, your no-fluff cheat code to becoming the voice everyone listens to. I'm your host, Makhokhodi. If you've been waiting for a permission slip to straighten your crown and take up space like you invented the blueprint, Madam Speaker Says got you covered. No whispers, no apologies, just you, me, and some bold-ass moves. Let's get into it. Welcome everyone to Madam Speaker Says. I am your host, Makhokhodi, and I am so delighted to have you listening today on this particular podcast. Our guest today is a baddie, okay? And the thing that really excites me is we share some DNA. I want to claim this for myself. I'm just gonna go out there and claim that we share like the tightest DNA. We're relatives. She's South African, I'm South African, and she's based in Australia, New Zealand right now. I'm dialing in from Mexico. There's a very interesting story to tell there, so maybe at some point we'll get into it. I am going to dive straight in and ask this amazing human being who is sitting here with us in the context of the work that you do, which is so varied, right? You are a thought leader. You are very much a storyteller. You're somebody who has 2 books underneath you, and you work in storytelling, like you help other people weave stories. Why is thought leadership so important? And I'm asking this, I have to contextualize, I'm asking this specifically in light of your writing, especially your writing this year, last year, always, but you are somebody who is such a clear truth teller and voice, right? We're living in a world where so much feels unhinged, and you have been very on the nose about actually, like, here's where you need to be focusing. Here's what matters. I'm thinking specifically about your writing about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, right? The Israeli genocide in Palestine. And I'm thinking very much about you as a writer who comes from a lineage of people who have always told the truth, thinking about South Africans, thinking about global writers as well. Why is thought leadership in this context? Why does it matter?
Hello, very good to be on. Very, very, very good to be in conversation with you and thinking together, I think. And thank you for all those wonderful and kind things that you've said about me. I guess, the older I get, the less convinced I am that what I'm doing is thought leadership. And so I suppose I want to maybe start from that, questioning the premise. So what are we doing when we think aloud? I think when we think aloud, we're trying to build something together. And so I'm interested in the kind of dialectics of what happens when I put something into the world, how people engage it, critique it, how it may shift something and how someone thinks in any direction. And I think part of why I'm questioning the notion of thought leadership for myself these days is because there are so many voices. There's been an explosion of voices. And because of that, conversation feels like a more important thing to focus on than the idea that anyone can lead a conversation. Um, Otherwise, we pull in multiple different directions and we're not thinking about how we intersect and how our ideas intertwine. And so maybe it's just a matter of semantics, right? But I raise it because it's something that's been on my mind lately. When I first started writing, um, you know, especially in the South African context, I feel like there was far fewer voices who were writing publicly in the way that I was, far fewer Black female voices. I think now there are more, although not certainly not enough. In South Africa, I think that space still remains very dominated, that formal kind of public sphere sort of space, which I think is different from TikTok and different from social media, is very much, I think, still dominated by a particular kind of older Black male voice and older white male voice. And so I think I had no problem. In fact, I thought it was really important to think about myself as a thought leader, right? With all the quotes that that implies. And now I think that the way that conversations have gone globally, the explosion of voices, the multiplicity, and in some ways, like the problems with thinking about ourselves as leaders make me question whether or not I want to position myself that way. So that's just as a kind of baseline foundational questioning. Doesn't I don't necessarily reject it, but I don't necessarily embrace that terminology. But I think what you're asking is obviously a deeper question, which is about like why situate yourself in the public domain? Like
Mhm.
why be in the public sphere and what does it take and what does it look like to be a Black woman who's in the public sphere?
And
Um,
also, and also, I mean, I would add to that, to be in the public sphere, right? Which is something like you said, so many voices are by default in the public sphere just because of how social media functions.
works, yeah.
What we're talking about is a step beyond that, right? You have access to certain platforms, you have a megaphone, if you will, that most people who are speaking about the ideas that we care about, they are not necessarily people who look like us or
Yes.
people who have access to those platforms. And that's the thing that I think, like, there's a power dynamic here. Let's name it that way. There's a power dynamic here that is really salient. And that's the question that I'm after. Why does it matter for Black, brown, woman, people who are marginalized, queer folks, people who are differently abled? Why does it matter for those folks to step into that kind of power where storytelling is amplified at that level?
Yeah, I think it matters for all the reasons we know, right? That there's a power to representation, which we can't deny. Um, and that uh, and that when we bring our lived experience into those spaces, what we're able to do is demonstrate to a much wider audience that you can come at questions differently, that you can come at questions in ways that don't kind of echo the normative frameworks that have been, kind of solidified over time, right? So you become a voice that is, you can become a voice that is disruptive in that
Mhm.
space, because your lived experience is so different and you're always going to come at questions differently. You can also become co-opted.
Of course.
And so one of the things that I've tried really hard to do, in some ways, not initially, not intentionally, but one of the things I'm really mindful of is not to get too comfortable in those spaces. So when I first started writing, I was so thrilled, so impressed. I had a long, big run in the New York Times. I was like, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the New York Times over the course of about a year and a
And
bit.
the Guardian, not just the Times.
But initially it was the Times, and that felt like really seductive. There felt like there was something super impressed. I was like impressed with it. I was impressed with myself for it. And we can talk about the mechanics of how that even happened, because
Yeah.
you talked about wanting to be granular about things, but we can talk about that later. But I also had so many critiques of
Mm.
the times, and those critiques have grown louder over time. And so you have to constantly weigh up, like, what does it mean to be in this? And what does it mean to maintain my critiques and my ability to withdraw from it? And that ability to come in and out of things, I think, is very, very important, particularly when these institutions are racist, they're misogynist, they're sexist. They carry and amplify messages that are so often against us.
Mhm.
And so it's important, I think, to be strategic about how and when we enter those spaces. And the ability to pull back for me is something that I'm realizing I'm constantly grappling with and playing with and withdrawing and then coming back and withdrawing and coming back and choosing a space that works better for me and then withdrawing. And I think being able to do that is really important in terms of just a kind of intellectual independence.
You know what you're saying is so it's not just provocative, but it really hits at something that I think is not spoken enough about, right? How do you protect yourself and the clarity that they saw initially in your truth telling? Like you had courage initially, you were doing something, you were saying something that was against, not even necessarily against, just against the grain of what they had on
Yeah.
their pages, right? Because if they already had it in their pages, why would they bother? But
Yeah.
then there's this tug on the other end that's about the prestige and the power and how we become seduced by power. And what I'm hearing from you is the importance of being alert to that. But then I want to know how. I mean, what are
How are
the
you alert to it?
well, how do you, I mean, you alluded to it just now. You take breaks. So you're in and
Yeah.
you're out and you decide when you want to be in and when you don't. But I think for a lot of people who are listening to this particular podcast, it might not necessarily be the times that they're writing for, but everybody who is listening has the experience of being the one. These are women
Yes.
who have expertise, they have
Yeah.
receipts, right? They've been in a boardroom where they're the only one. And in
Yeah.
that boardroom, wherever it is the decisions are being made, that is a seat of power, right?
Yes.
And it
Yes.
is easy to be co-opted into power. And my question is, how? How do you
Yeah.
remain clear about what your
Yeah.
assignment is when you walk into those positions?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. One is the space will tell you when it's time for you to step back. Something will happen, right? I mean, that's how racism operates. Something will happen. So you will submit a piece and you'll get edits back and you'll be like, this
Mhm.
doesn't reflect me. I'm not comfortable with this. And I'm having to fight too hard for this to be heard. So it's time for me to move on. Or I submitted this and they've accepted it, but I silenced myself in the doing of it. Like I felt a capitulation, a small, quiet capitulation, and I don't like that in myself. So it's about that kind of spirit level, that thing where you know that you have either overstepped something that you didn't like or that you were about to.
Mhm.
And so for me, that's a danger zone. That's just something over time I have learned to listen to and to follow that instinct. And the question is, and I think in some ways, a writing relationship is a very privileged one, of course, because you do it piece by piece. And I think in a job, when it's your career, when you're sitting in the C-suite or you're sitting in a boardroom or you're sitting in a even a much sort of less fancy situation and you have to go to work every day, I think that's a very different kind of relationship and you have far less power and the stakes are very, very different, right? So for me, it can simply be a matter of ego and listening to my ego is much easier when I don't have a long-term contractual relationship with any of these
Mhm.
publishing houses, right? And then it's different when actually this is my job and I have to show up every day to put food on the table. And that's a different kind of
Yes.
courage. And that's a different calculus that's going on around how we weigh up pragmatism. And so the strategy there is around like, how much can I take? how am I weighing up looking for something else while I'm here? How am I weighing up speaking out? Who are my allies? Like all of that kind of mapping. And, one of the things I think we all learn, and I hope people learn, is like, there is no situation that I don't war game. I am
Mm.
always, always like, if this,
Soldiers
then what?
speak.
If this, then what? If that, then what? Um, we we can't float through life. My mother, she passed away 10, 11 years ago, and the thing that she taught me by example was that you need to have as many options on the table in your life as possible.
Mm,
That, independence is about maximizing options,
mm.
in a way that has integrity. In fact, your integrity comes from having those options, right?
It's interesting.
So I'm in any given situation, I'm always trying to think like, hey, what are my options here? How do I have more options? Even as I'm entering, I'm like, what's my escape plan? I'm never all in. I'm all in my writing on the page,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but any institution, I
You ain't my daddy, is what she's trying to say.
exactly, exactly.
You is not
Absolutely.
my daddy. Okay. And
Yep.
also war strategies. I love this. I
Mm.
want to ask you something that comes from that. I think what you just said, and I'm really sorry for the loss of your mom. It's 10 years ago. She's still your mother. Um,
Yeah,
and
always.
I want to acknowledge her wisdom, the thing that, you're sharing that she shared with you through example, that
Yeah.
integrity actually comes from options. And I think that this is so beautifully related to what I see you doing right now, right? You're flexing so much of what are the different options that you have. As somebody who has an extremely big platform, you've written for The Guardian, like we said, the New York Times, but you've also got a Substack. And it's accessible to just about anybody, right? Anybody can start a Substack.
Yep.
Can you
Yep.
talk about that, what that experience is, and also tease out this idea because it's really fascinating of what does it mean that integrity comes from options, especially as somebody who is invested in how do I get my expertise out there?
Yep. So I'm having doubts about the Substack at the moment, for lots of reasons. Lots
Yeah.
of reasons. One is that it there are many questions about the platform itself, like neo-Nazis. There's lots of political questions,
Mhm.
which are no different from the questions about Instagram, which are no different from the questions about Twitter, which I left a long time ago. So I think we always have to kind of balance these things out. But I think the more important question I'm having about Substack is not about Substack itself, but it's about what it means to write in this moment of genocide. What is the value? What is the importance? Why should my words matter? And are they a distraction or are they something that builds? And that's a big question that everyone is asking themselves. But I have to say, this moment has really gotten to me and it's really affected my writing. It really, really has affected my writing a lot.
What
But I think,
can I
sorry.
can I ask what are you learning in real time that you can share right now?
In my storytelling practice, I tell people that a story is not a story until it's over.
Hmm.
And that if you're trying to talk about something while you're living it, you don't know enough to be helpful. And I feel like that's really where I'm at with this present moment in my writing. Like I'm so happy to talk about, the writing that I've done in the past and how did you write the books and blah, 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 blah. But right now, I have to say, I've never experienced anything like this. I've never had such a crisis of my own words, um, a real existential crisis of like, why write? And I know intellectually, like the answers, I know because I'm reading, like I'm reading other people, I'm so I'm engaged at an intellectual level in other people's writing. I'm just not sure what my writing has to add to this particular moment. And I say that again, even as I know that people have read my writing, in this moment and found it helpful, but it's a tough time to be trying to write. And there are lots of things about the genocide that feel like they are, as a South African, you would understand this. It's like it's it feels like there, but by the grace of God go I. Like if someone had just decided to do everything imaginable to us
Mhm.
and nobody had helped us,
Mhm.
then this is what it would have been. And in that context, I wonder
Mhm.
what anyone's words on a Substack would have meant. And that's where I go there. And I don't think it's particularly helpful to share that in this moment because I don't have the answers to it. But it's also would be like it would be fake to pretend like I'm like just okay in my writing. I'm definitely not. And in some ways, I think that's why so much of my energy at this moment is really focused on helping other people tell their stories because my capacity
Mhm.
right now is like so limited.
Mhm.
So I'm very busy with other people's stories because
Mhm.
I also don't want to say, and nor do I think that other people's stories don't matter and that stories, period, don't matter. I'm just questioning my capacity at this moment to say the things that I want to say in the way that I want to say it in a way that feels like it has meaning. But other people, oh my God, I live for other people's stories and for help, for facilitating those to find their way into the world.
Yeah.
Which is something I've been doing, I guess, in one way or another, at least for the last decade.
I want to jump into that conversation about other people's stories and the work that you're doing there. But before we get there, I want to
Yeah.
pause on what you just said, right? Because I actually think that you've given us a really profound roadmap for what it means to do the kind of work that is about truth telling in this
Mm.
moment and in moments when shit hits the fan and is not always cute, right? And I want to say it to you by using your own words. Because one of the things that struck me when I was getting ready for this conversation is you speak about the importance of knowing when you are telling a story. Is it a wound? Are you speaking from a scar or are you speaking
Yes.
from a wound, right?
Yes.
And one of the other things that you just said now in this conversation, at the top of this conversation, is you characterize thought leadership as thinking out loud. So if those two things are true at the same time, it seems to me
Mhm.
are practicing that, even
Mm.
in pausing, right? Like
Yeah.
this is a thing that's
Yeah.
really interesting to me, Sisonke. We think about truth tellers as people who have megaphones and who are constantly like just shouting into the public square. And that's so important. That's part of the job. But
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
silence is also, especially when we're in the middle of a lot of noise. Like
Mm.
we're not, I think that in wanting to center Black, brown, marginalized, queer voices, we're not asking people to just make more noise. That's
Yeah.
not useful. I don't know
That's
how
such
it
a good
gets us.
way. That's a good way of framing. It's a really good way of framing that there's a lot of noise and sometimes silence is actually the best response for a while. Yeah.
Until the clarity to understand, okay, what is it that is my story to tell here, right?
Exactly. 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 Yeah. And that's a big part of my storytelling practice with people who I coach and mentor and do training with. It's like, this story isn't for you right now. So
Mm,
let's just find another one. Let's
mm.
just find another story to tell. So I'm very good at giving the advice.
Surprise, surprise.
I'm good at giving the
The
advice. It's a
doctor
very
her
good
own
way to put it.
medicine. Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is nice because it leads me to Escala and the
Hmm.
story that you shared about her. So,
Yes.
for a little bit of context for folks who don't know your work, you're now based in Perth, Australia, right? And
Yeah.
you're working with folks who are migrants to Australia, as well as
Yeah.
Indigenous people, helping them
Yeah.
tell their own stories. Am I
That's
correct?
right.
in that?
Exactly.
And one of the things I thought is really fascinating, I'd love you to tell the story of Ascala and what you learned. But before that, just a heartbeat. Can you talk about the distinction that you see between storytelling and this kind of thought leadership as we've been describing it that's related to power?
Yeah. So I think the thought leadership stuff is very much about the realm of ideas. So how do we influence public discussions about things that matter, whether it's public health, whether it's detention facilities, human rights, so a range of social justice issues, racism, all of the things that many of us have spent, that I've certainly spent a lot of my life working around in quite systematic ways. So that the thought leadership stuff is really about the realm of ideas and the public's and putting those into the public sphere and influencing where things go from an advocacy perspective. And then I think storytelling can do that and often can be an effective tool to doing that. But storytelling is the kind that I do is certainly first person narrative storytelling that is very much about using your experiences to shift something in how someone else feels. And so it really exists at the feeling level, at the heart level, and a lot of the thought leadership stuff exists at the head level. And in the best case scenario, you do both,
Yeah.
right? And so a lot of the programs that we've run at the Center for Stories, of course, involve people in really vulnerable situations. And some of those have resulted in policy forums, right, where you bring the storyteller into a space where there are going to be people there who can learn from and benefit from. And there's a shift, an attempt to shift, public discourse, but also importantly, policy. And in fact, the kind of big project I'm working on at the moment around First Nation storytellers um, is very much, or that's very much the intention, is to map a series of stories with people and then from the stories build out the kind of audience that needs to be listening to those stories in a very intentional way. So yeah, so in some ways I'm interested in the intersection of the two, but I also respect and appreciate that there's a craft to storytelling that is quite a different thing from the kind of thought leadership work, which tends to be written, and the storytelling that I do tends to be oral. So it's oral storytelling, which is in keeping with our traditions.
Of course it is. Which is apropos to this woman, Ascala, who is from Ethiopia. Can you tell us a little bit about what she taught you?
Sure. So I had just arrived. I had just started working at the Center for Stories. So this story is now, I don't know, like it's one of my earliest stories, and I use it a lot in training and in public speaking because it was such a lesson for me. So we used to have this event called Food for Thought, and it was a monthly event. And it was to raise money around refugee rights. Australia had, at the time, a very draconian policy of sending refugees and asylum seekers to Manus Island, um, in breach of international law. And so we were attempting to raise money around those issues. And so we would have a storytelling session once a month. So the session worked like this. A person comes in, I train them. So we sit together, I listen to the story, we figure out what's the best way to deliver the story in a way that kind of represents what they want to do. So Ascala comes in. She was one of actually our very first storytellers for this event series. So she comes in, sits down. I hadn't met her before. We sort of start to get to know each other a little bit. And I say, okay, Ascala, what's your story? So she starts to tell the story and she reaches a certain point in the story and she starts crying. So
Mm.
she's crying and I start crying. I'm a crier. And like there's very few storytelling sessions where you will not find me sitting with the person I'm coaching and but we both are just
Huddle.
like weeping. So I cry, Ascala cries. I'm like, it's okay, we've got time. So she comes back, our next session about a week later. Same thing happens. Now we're both in tears, right? And we haven't gotten much further along with the story. Third time, same thing. So now I'm like, wow, okay, what's going on? How are we going to solve? How are we going to solve the story? Like, and then I kind of step back a little bit, and it sounds, so simple now, but we were invested in telling a particular kind of story, right? So I said, Ascala, like, this is hurting too much. This is really, really hard. And it feels like you're not ready to tell this story. So why are you telling this story? And that simple question for both of us was really, really important. And Askala was like, because Australians always want to know where you're from, right?
Right.
And it's that like trauma porn, refugee porn expectation that we buy into ourselves, right? And so it helped me to also think a little bit to go back to our earlier conversation about what the public sphere is. It's not just that we tell stories, it's that what is the nature of the stories that we tell?
Mm,
In whose interest is that story being told? What
mm.
are we doing to ourselves in service of that story? And what does it mean if in the public domain in a place like Australia, the only stories that we ever hear are stories about the suffering of African people?
Right.
That's not right. So it immediately, and I knew that at an intellectual level. What I hadn't understood is how we were playing that out,
Mm,
right? That we were enmeshed in this way of telling. And so I was like, oh my God, but who said that we have to talk about your story of coming to Australia? And then we kind of both looked at each other, we're like, actually, right?
right.
So then we chose a different story, right? Because the other thing about all of us as human beings is that we have so many stories. We don't have a singular story, right? We have so many, there are so many things that we can pull out about a particular moment or a thing that happened, right? We have a kind of unified story when you add all of it up, right? We have an impression of who we
Right.
are.
Exactly.
But we have so many stories. And so immediately Askala and I shifted. And then I said, so think about a story. And she said, you know what I missed? And I said, she said, yeah, that's right. And she said, you know, one of the reasons I was also going to tell the story is because Australians always say to you, gosh, you must be so lucky. You're so lucky to be here,
Ah, yes. Ah, yes.
right?
Yes,
You're so,
you got out.
you got out.
But it's okay. In America, the way that you hear it is, oh, but isn't it fantastic you're here now? It's some acknowledgement of like, but you made it, you know?
Exactly. Right. So when we talked about it, it was like, they have no idea how much we miss home,
Mm,
right? And so the story we told, that Askala told, was a story about Ethiopian New Year
mm,
and the beauty of what it meant for her family to prepare. It was like one of her starkest memories of childhood was just every year preparing for Ethiopian New Year. That her parents, her dad owned a truck, and so her mom would send him all over the place to get the best butter, which she would refine
mm,
and clarify over weeks, right? To get popcorn, to get the finest chickens, like all of this stuff, right? And that eventually on the day it would be like this massive celebration. So many things are happening in the story, right? At the same time. The things that are happening in the story is the sophistication of that particular culture, the long, long history of Orthodox Christianity that has existed in Ethiopia, that is a longer form of Christianity than in most parts of the world. What's happening is this joy, this family, this sense that it's so hard to leave that kind of love and a place like that, right? So the horror of this imagined place is replaced by the beauty of this very real place in her existence, in her life, in her memories, right? So we're ticking so many of the boxes of what we need to feel empowered and to feel like we're telling a true story. And at the same time, smashing a bunch of stereotypes for those who would listen closely enough to take that seriously, right? So Ascala was a very, very powerful, like she really helped me to kind of step back in my storytelling practice and listen out for all of these things like I knew theoretically. Yeah.
I love this story so much. That's why I asked you to tell it. You know, I'd heard it on a different stage and I wanted you to.
Yeah.
I think it's so powerful and it's so useful for the person who is listening, right? Because we are right to be reticent about telling our most intimate stories, whether we have the experience of having been a refugee. Like people who are listening to this are listening from all over the world and from
Yes.
every
Yep.
different kind of life experience. And a lot of the women who are listening, a lot of the men who are listening, they're people who have a lot of power and access to privilege, right? And I think
Yep.
one of the things that we're really aware of and we're keen about is I actually don't want to get on a stage and talk about Soweto in a way that is just feeding the machine of poverty porn and a white supremacist lens that's like a tourist thing of
Absolutely.
how you see us when you look at us. And what I think
Absolutely.
is so powerful that you're inviting people to think about is when we are the agents of our own storytelling, then we get to tell these other stories that have never been told. Like
Absolutely.
New Year
Absolutely.
in Ethiopia, like
It was beautiful.
show me the
Beautiful.
movie.
And she has this lovely, at the end she told this, and I loved it from the minute I heard it, then every year her dad would get her mom this perfume. And then every year her mom would act like it was a surprise. And she'd be like, "Oh, what's this? Perfume? Oh, for me. Oh, you shouldn't have." And then she would like spray it all over herself and spray it all over the kids. And then he would say, "Hey, woman, do you think that I got this perfume from the Nile?" It was just like the cutest, like so many lovely distinct moments in that story, but 100% what we do when we tell the truth about ourselves in a way that has full agency and doesn't capitulate to what other people's expectations are is
Yes,
that we do the combating of all of those stereotypes. We push back against all of that racism, but we do it in a way that is effortless. It isn't effortless, but it appears to be effortless. And more importantly, that it feeds something within us,
yes,
right? That it's
yes,
generative, it's regenerative for us in a way that often the kind of finger wagging, shouting, fighting that we also have to do, and that I also value and honor, but in a way that kind of fighting sometimes doesn't feel generative and it doesn't feel restorative and it doesn't calm the nervous system. Yeah.
yeah, that's powerful. I want to shift gears a little bit and
Yep.
talk about your becoming as somebody who tells stories, as somebody who shapes ideas, thoughts that then go on to influence our culture, influence our society. Let's go all the way back to the very beginning of a very young Sisonke. When in your journey do you see seeds of this? These are the things that both shaped me, but then opened doors to this honestly very opaque lifestyle, right? Of being somebody who shapes ideas and who is a writer, thinker. Where do you see moments that were inflection moments that were like, okay, this
Mm,
person making this connection that allowed
yep.
me, you were saying earlier, you were writing for the New York Times. How did that come about? But
Yep.
don't start with the New York Times because that feels like
Okay.
very, very recent and an
Yeah.
arrival
Yeah.
point. It's more, how did you get there? How did you get to then this moment where the New York Times happens?
Yeah. Okay, let me open the dryer because it's beeping and it's
Oh,
gonna start.
please do it.
Multitasking.
Must happen. While I have you here on Madam Speaker Says, and we wait for our wonderful guest, Sisonke Msimang, I want to invite you to take our quiz to learn a little bit more about the kind of thought leader, storyteller that you are. I want you to understand what kind of influence do you have and where are the places in your storytelling, in your thought leadership where you're shining, you're a superstar, and then where are the places where you could use a little bit more support. This is an interactive quiz. All of the details are in the show notes. I hope that you check it out and it's personalized to you. So the results are specific to where you are today and how you answer it. Sisonke, thank you for that ad break.
Okay, so I think a few things. I think there's the kind of grand backdrop of growing up in 1970s and 1980s and 1990s with apartheid looming and being a child who was raised in exile. So the kind of big story of this battle that was taking place in my country was profoundly shaped how I thought about myself, what my reason for being even was. So to have a father who was a freedom fighter and who really had made a decision to leave South Africa to literally like pick up a gun, to go to Russia, to do military training, like all of that stuff felt like that was a kind of framing for my sisters and I growing up. I think also the fact that we were three girls, um, and that we were three girls who were much loved and were never made to feel as though there was something wrong with none of us being a boy in a context and an environment where there were other families where that was a big deal. Was again sort of, so I can't pin it to one moment, but it's a foundational thing that was very important. And then I think there is something about being raised by a bunch of revolutionaries. You know, one of my earliest uncles, someone who was profoundly important to me, big mates with my father, was Uncle Curtis Powell, who was part of the Panther 21, was, you know, spent over 18 months at Rikers Island, you know, for something that he didn't do. You know, he was a participant in the Columbia breakfast, you know, feeding program, and had his entire life upended as a physicist, and as a chemist, a brilliant, brilliant African American man, because the US government was, you know, raiding his apartment and ruining his life, right? So there was the kind of an environmental thing that was happening with us. And then, of course, having these extraordinary aunties around who were ANC aunties, but who were also blood. And I think a huge influence for me, in addition to my parents, in addition to my mom, was Goko Lindy, who was Lindiwe Mabuza, a poet, a revolutionary, the first person who made me, I think, in many ways fall in love with writing. And we used to play this game. I'll never forget, the Olympics was going to be in 1984. So it would have been 1980. And we started preparing for the Olympics. So I'm like a tiny little kid. So even 1984, I was like not going to be old enough to be in any Olympics. But for her and
Oh, she
I,
was training you for the
she
actual.
was training me. Okay, this person
I
cannot,
didn't
she cannot even jog half a mile. Okay.
understand. That's
But
hilarious.
I like gymnastics. So if I like gymnastics, why the hell can't I be an Olympic gymnast, right? This was a very real fantasy for both of us. Like we practiced a lot. Like there were outfits, things were happening towards the
It's a little
momentum of this.
hilarious. Thank God you were young, because it's also what are we doing right now, Auntie?
It was very real. So that kind of belief, right? There was nothing that
Oh, special.
there was nothing that we could dream that wasn't possible, right? So I feel like that was definitely like, you know, uh I think we were like Gen Z kids before Gen Z,
But
you
wait, I
know?
have to stop you. Sisonke, I have to stop you, because here's the thing, right? That we have to paint a picture for somebody who doesn't know our context.
Yeah.
1980, we're moving into 1984 South Africa. Like, the country is burning, first of all.
Burning.
The country is literally burning. State of
Yeah.
emergency every single day. You're
Yeah.
living as a refugee. You know, in South Africa, it's interesting. We use the word, no, our exiles. These people are exiles.
Yeah.
Yes, but the
Yes, we were refugees.
but
That's
they,
what they called us. Most of the
you were
people
a refugee.
where we were called refugees.
You
Let
were a
us be very
refugee.
clear.
That was your status. Like, they stamp the paper and they say, "Hey, Bantiti refugee." So what I want to
Definitely.
know, and this is not something to laugh at, to gloss over, to, do
Mm.
anything except for have reverence for, that people who are in that kind of a predicament, you don't have a home anywhere on earth that recognizes you. And yet you have this kind of like self-belief of like, oh, Olympics are coming. Oh, psh, bet. We're
First,
doing this. Like,
first South African child to be at the Olympics. That's who you will be.
these two things, like, make them, how does this math add up?
I think the math adds up because you have to be that kind of person
Mm.
to cross a border. um, under severe threat of your life. Like when I,
Yes.
lots of times when I actually think about what that meant to be a 21-year-old kid and to cross the border into Botswana and then to I've never seen a plane. You know, the other day I was laughing with my dad because he was telling me this story. It's one of his favorite stories about like this uncle that they had when they were growing up, and they would ask him to speak English because he was one of the few people.
Probably the entire district, black man speaks English.
So he would
Therefore,
say, and
yep.
he had one line of English that he knew, and he would say, I am going to Camps Bay for holiday. Will you come with me?
Um,
You
well,
know, so it's like this, you know, this man who grew up in rural, you know, KZN, and yeah, just like anyway. So yes, you're right. There is a very serious context, and in part why it's possible is because it was a self-selected community of people
mm,
who were, you know, honestly, and I always say this, like the person who has affected my life more than anyone else other than my parents was Nelson Mandela. So definitely inspired by the example of this guy who literally, like, you know, traveled around Africa, made speeches. It's like he's this larger than life character, but he was a living, you know, human. And for all my critiques that we can have about the Rainbow Nation, like all of that notwithstanding, the reality is like this is the guy who influenced them. And so this was a very self-selected group of people. And Uncle Oliver Tambo was living in Lusaka, right? So we were absolutely uh, there were threats of danger. Absolutely, we were refugees. Absolutely, there was a lot of scripping and scrapping, and there were many people sleeping on the floor, you know, in different people's houses. And yes, we were, you know, constantly singing freedom songs. You know, we were trained, you know, lots of, but ultimately, the belief really powered us, you know, into the future. And I don't feel like I had, and gets back to our conversation about storytelling. The story that I tell is a story about the gymnastics and the Olympics because that is that's what I felt. I felt like an extraordinarily loved and held child in this community of people. And it never once really occurred to me that we would not achieve freedom. Not in the hands of these people, right? It just was impossible to me that we would not achieve freedom. And so, yeah, so that's why the gymnastic story, right? That's where it comes from.
but the reason
Yeah,
why I wanted us to stop there and to have a heartbeat for it is the audacity of that kind of imagination, right? And to remind the person that's listening who hears you talking about yourself as an opinion writer for the New York Times and hears that as like, well, that's clearly like way beyond where I am right now. Or that's not quite like, yeah, you're speaking about something that's not in my
yeah,
stratosphere. I'm not
yeah,
asking you to go back to 1980 or training for 1984 for the sake of let's all remember,
yeah,
we were sleeping on the floor.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
asking you for that moment, for this person who's listening to
yeah,
understand that the audacity of a powerful story is that it sees you today, not for these circumstances around you, but for actually who you are becoming, right? And this is a podcast that is for people who are becoming thought leaders. They're not yet published in the New York Times, they're not yet standing on TED stage. But
yeah,
today, you need to
yeah.
understand, you need to have that level of belief that, yes, I am, full stop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it never would have occurred to me or my sisters or any of the kids that we grew up, you know, around. It never would have occurred to us that we couldn't do what we wanted to do. And in fact, what we were in training to do was to become the future leaders of South Africa. Again, lots and lots, we can say lots and lots of things um, about the limits of that and what that means for an exile community that feels like is entitled to come back and lead, you know, who the hell are you? But you're right. I mean, audacity is the perfect word for that. And I think to be audacious in the face of so much structural violence and power exerting itself upon you it's almost a miracle, right? It's a profound thing. And so to meet your circumstances with audacity
Yes.
is to refuse to do the opposite, which is to meet your circumstances with fear, with anxiety, with apology. And that's a gift that I've been given. You know, I wish I could say that I am the one who decided to meet my circumstances with audacity, but that was an inheritance. That was a gift. So there's no moment that I will be faced with that will ever be as big as that, right? And so the gift that I've been given by my parents and by that community and by the legacy of many, many people that I never even met, you know, the affinity that you and I have for civil rights leaders, for the African American struggle, for people who were enslaved everywhere, right? The affinity that we have is that we know that the gift that they gave was not just of
Exactly.
survival, but was of audacity,
Exactly.
right? You know, to be Frederick Douglass and to learn how to read, to say, I will not just read, but I will write some of the most incredible prose this world has ever
Ever,
seen.
ever, ever, ever in the English language.
So that's that kind of audacity. And yeah, as I say, I wish I could say that that was my own invention, but it's absolutely a gift and inheritance that so many of us have. If you are a person from any kind of marginalized community, that too is your gift. You may not, and this is again to go back to story, like this is why reading the story is important. So
Mm-hmm.
to really to look at like what am I looking at when I think about this story? What are the silences? What are the things in the story that I know to be true, that are about empowerment, that give me a way to read the play, as it were, right? And to understand what they knew. Because, you know, our people don't always tell the stories in the way that we would have wanted them to. And so I think it's incumbent on us to think about what were they really saying. Sometimes they don't say it as plainly because they weren't allowed to, right? Or yeah, because of all the forces against us. But I think it's important to relook at stories, right? And that's I think a huge part of what are you doing as you shape yourself as this person who is bringing stories to the stage. What are you doing as you think about the world that you want to help create? What you're doing is you're looking backwards and
Mm-hmm.
you're reassessing the stories that you've been told. And I think as a younger person, I feel like I was often arrogant in feeling like I was the first person to be a particular way. And the older I get, the more I am able to recognize courage in moments that I wouldn't have seen it before.
But isn't that the gift of youth, right?
Yeah,
The,
it
the
is. It is. Otherwise, we wouldn't get anything done,
Exactly.
right?
Thank God, because we would never get anything done.
Yeah.
This work that you are reminding us of, looking back and understanding the gift that we have received, especially for our times now. One of the things that I've been reflecting on is, what does it mean to be writing stories in a time of genocide? I work primarily in fiction, right? I
Yeah.
also write other work, but primarily like the meat of how I show up on the page in
Yeah.
literature is fiction.
It's fiction.
And
Yeah.
I ask myself, like, what are you doing sitting here writing stories? And this is happening in real time.
Yeah.
And your your invocation and your invitation that the work has to be in relationship to understanding what our ancestors have given us as a
Yeah.
blueprint, right, for a time like this. It is, yes, to write the stories, but to write the stories in a way where you can say things that they couldn't say, right?
That's right.
And also the toolkit that we have for facing the fear, that we're not reduced to like, oh, this is really difficult. Oh, how do I do this? We go back to the audacity that somebody could have had in
Yeah.
1980 to think about themselves this particular way. That's
Yeah.
that's not like a little bit. And then also, we're both two South Africans sitting here, the recognition that we're not talking just about us full stop, right? Thank
Yeah.
God we have read, we've picked up books, we've listened to people from all over the world and learned from them. No, this is a story that every single marginalized person has access to. Like that, if there's no more, like that's the mic drop right there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That we, yeah. And again, build on what you're saying, like the reason why stories matter so much is because ultimately it's so possible when you listen to someone tell a story, it is so possible to imagine yourself as them.
Absolutely.
And often it's possible to imagine yourself as them because of, fundamental human empathy, but also because the underpinning experiences of being a human being are so universal, right?
But that's also
And
why they're so dangerous, the stories. And especially when the mic is in our hands, it's dangerous because when somebody's working to dehumanize you, and here you are telling a story that's taking down that dehumanization, it's like, well, now what? Like
right.
immigrants in the United States, the whole idea of like, oh my God, they're coming to eat your dogs and your cats.
Yeah.
And then you hear this person tell the story of, who they are.
Yeah.
It completely debunks these crazy ideas.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And that, the system is set up so that all of us see one another as opponents, and that the power of stories for me increasingly is not even so much in convincing someone who might hate me to not hate me. I'm less and
Mm,
less interested in that.
mm,
It's in building solidarities. It's
mm,
in it's in demonstrating to someone who is like me how much more like me than they thought they might be, right?
mm,
That we
mm,
have common cause, and that solidarity ultimately is the only way, it's the only way we've ever gotten anything done,
mm.
you
You
know.
spoke about a younger version of yourself, and that the older you become, you think about that younger version, and sounds like you chuckle with wisdom.
Yeah.
Tell me if that younger version walked into, you went to McAllister, right?
I did, yeah.
Went to McAllister. This person walks into your offices. You've got office hours at McAllister. And they want to know, Sisonke, how do I carve out this career where I want to write for the New York Times? And I am someone who is working with all kinds of storytellers, be they someone from Ethiopia or a really powerful woman who sits on boards in Australia, right? And I'm helping her craft stories. What are the paths to becoming that type of thought leader in quotations? Because I know it's a contested term.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for me, it was like a recipe. And it goes back to this question of putting as many options on the table as possible. So I am a serial applier to fellowships and programs and sort
Mm.
of self-improvement things. I'm a big believer in them. I also believe in doing the right ones, so ones that are practical in
What does that
nature.
mean?
So I think there's lots of ways that we could fritter away our money on self-improvement programs that don't help us and don't give us practical skills, because it feels like you're doing something,
Mhm.
right? So I think there's the self-improvement industrial complex preys on a kind of paralysis that's very easy for people to feel, particularly in the creative sector, when
Mhm.
the metrics of what it looks like to achieve are often really hard because rejection is commonplace, because it's so competitive, because there's only so many spots in a literary journal or in a magazine, so
Yes.
it's hard to achieve. And so you can spend a lot of time, applying for competitions or applying for programs to help you be better, and they're not necessarily going to do that. So I think it's important to think about what is the opportunity that you're going for,
Mm.
but then go for those opportunities, particularly where they have a kind of practical component. And so I did this wonderful fellowship in, I don't even remember when it was, 2012, 2013. And it was designed for thought leaders. So it was very much in this space. It was designed for people who lived in developing countries. So I was still living in Joburg, quote unquote, right? So it was for people from the global south who were experts in something, particularly around, social justice, public health. So, solving problems, as it were. So this program was designed, for, experts who are living in a country, doing the work, helping to solve and contribute to their country's problems, and who don't have access to global media, right?
Mm.
So when
Mm.
the New York Times wants to report on um, events in the Congo, they go and interview Jeffrey Sachs. They
Yeah.
interview someone from the Brookings Institution, which was outrageous, right? So that is a question about access. It's a question about social capital. It's a question about networks. It is not a question about expertise, right? So
Mm.
the program basically said, we're going to match up people who are on the ground, who understand the complexity of their own country's issues, and we are going to make sure that they find the platform. And the finding the platform has got nothing to do with sending a million emails to the pitch line of The Guardian or The Times or whoever. It's got everything to do with knowing the exact name of the exact editor who is going to smile when they see your name and be like, yeah, of course. And
Because
so that's
because you didn't even send the email. Somebody held your hand and essentially linked your hand with that editor, right?
that's
So
exactly what happened. That's literally exactly what happened. So we did the course, we did so of course I had to learn how to write an op-ed piece, and I had to learn what an American audience would be interested in and sort of the form and the stuff. Absolutely. So, and that was essential, right? So that also deeply helpful, right? It's one thing to look at it as a published version. It's another thing to know, to have the mechanics of how you do it. And the training was amazing. So this was done by the Aspen Institute. So great, great, great. Then they link you up with a media mentor. And my mentor was Courtney Martin. Shout out to Courtney. Incredible, incredible, incredible woman. And she introduced me to an editor at the New York Times, as in literally like email. Hi, David. You
yes,
would love to meet this woman. Her name is Sisonke. She is from South Africa, and she's written a piece about this. Would you have a look? And David says, oh, Courtney, so great to hear from you. The last time we were in touch, blah, blah, blah.
yes.
Friend, Tomzas. Real buddies, right?
Listen, Sisonke, one of the things I'm so, so grateful for you sharing the story on the podcast, because one of the things that was a rude education to me when I first came to college in America was just how much careers depend on these kinds of relationships. And by the way, I don't think this is something you learn only if you're in America, right? If I had stayed in South Africa and done my college years there,
Yes,
same
same thing.
education.
Yeah,
It's the whites, mostly in South Africa, it's mostly these white kids. They get that first break. I'm not saying
that's
they
right.
don't work hard, blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
But that first break comes because such and such said, hey, da 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 da. And it's not only the relationship itself and knowing which fellowships to apply to, but it's also that grooming, that
That's
schooling
right.
at home where somebody tells you this is how things get done. So you can't say if you're listening to this podcast that you didn't know anymore. If you're listening
That's
to
right.
this podcast, we just gave you the tea. The way this stuff gets done is you need to find your way into a mentor's life. And
That's right.
could be reaching out directly to the mentor, or it could be joining a program like at ASP. Do you remember the exact name of the fellowship?
It
Because
was called the New Voices Fellowship.
New Voices Fellowship. I'll look and see. I'm pretty sure it's still going. And
I
see if
think that I think that it's actually winding down. It had an incredible 10-year run, and then because Gates funding, all of these global terror that's been instigated by various people in the United States has meant that there's been a real shifting of priorities around who gets funded. And so, of course, the things that are first to go are the
yes.
things that aren't bread and butter. The things that actually are so strategic and so influential are the things that are first to be cut. So I think that they're contracting. I wouldn't say that it's closed yet, but it's certainly contracting. Yeah.
Are there other fellowships that come to mind? And if not, I do want to just let people know it's not only about institutional support, right? The things that have been most useful to me has just been reaching out to folks that I'm like, I follow this person, I admire what they're
Yeah.
doing. It's so easy to find somebody's
It's,
email. Literally, you
yep.
can type somebody's name and put email at the end in Google And I'd say 6 out of 10 times something comes out. Maybe
Yep.
it's right. You play around with the format and you find something. My point is the idea that folks aren't accessible to you, that's maybe 1980 when you were running
Yep.
around getting ready.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I think it's two things, right? So the one very, very spot on. I get requests all the time from people. Hi, Sisonke, I came across you this. I watch your TED Talk. Please, I'd love to chat, blah, blah, blah. I try to say yes to as much as I can. I don't say yes to everything, but I try very hard. And part of the calculation for me is that probably 9 out of 10 times I will click on who they are, what they've done. So it's both that you do the reach out, but it's that I then see that you've done stuff, that you're grinding. I'm very interested in how are you coming at
Show
things.
me. Show me.
Am I the person who's going to be able to actually be helpful to you? And I only know by what I see you've put into the world. So, so those two really work together. It's really important to be doing your thing, to be showing up in the world in a particular way because, it will be, people will see it, and those mentors you reach out to will figure out whether or not they're gonna spend time with you based on how you're showing up in the world.
Exactly, exactly right. Like you with Courtney, when you first reached out to Courtney, she already had an op-ed in hand that she could hand to this editor of the New York Times and say, she's already written this piece, it's about South Africa, and it's exactly what you're looking for. So make sure you actually have a portfolio of work that resonates and makes it easy. And also, one of the things that struck me when you're sharing that story, she was actually doing that person a gift, right? When she was reaching out to David at the New York Times. Of course, she wrote it casually like that because she was doing David a favor. Like, I'm helping
Absolutely.
you out. Like, trust me, you are going to thank me for this. It's not the other way around. So,
And it,
sure.
yeah, and such a good way of putting it because, and the other part that the other thing that Courtney did that I again will be forever grateful is so we did it. He said yes. It was like magic. It was like this secret door portal that just had opened, and I was like, oh, so we did it. He said yes. I submitted. I sent him a little pitch. He said, "Yep, go for it. Do it by this." And then the paper came back bloody, like bloody. I had been writing for South African, newspaper, and no one was touching and this thing was like red, bleeding, and I was like, what?
What are you doing?
And it was like sucked dry and my voice was, and I was like, what? And I had Courtney, and
Mhm.
Courtney was like, this is normal. This, you can push back. So I had this guide to be like, calm down. This is not just you. She's like, mine come back worse. Don't worry about it. Like, this is not. So it was helpful to figure out what to take personally and what not to take personally. And most of it, and this is what it means to be edited, right? You know this
Yep.
very well, right? But
Yep.
also at a level which was incredibly helpful for me. That voice, that editorial voice, that this particular editor had, really good. Like really, really helped my own writing practice, really helped me lift my game. And so that was also helpful for me not to take too much offense and to understand what was going on, what was normal. Because again, it's the first time you've done it. Why would you know whether it's normal or not, right? And then the last thing that she did, which again, I just thought, wow, this is great, is that the next time I wanted to pitch, I went back to her and I was like, Courtney, I've got a great idea and